passe pas bien. En fait, j'entends rien sur les micros, je sais pas pourquoi. Je vais essayer de je le mets dans sa boîte et je le ressors. Alors ça va être quelque chose. Вот он просто. pas de plan de déménagement parce que je suis L'ambassade de France a fini par recommander à ce maintenant, l'ambassadeur va passer par Amman et le client va passer par Amman. Mais bon. Je pense que Marco, il fa che poco Marco, sa una situazione. S'il y a des choses à dire. Oui, je suis c'est bon. Les gens sont encadrés en même temps. C'est assez extraordinaire. Nous sommes dans les classiques, toucher toutes les cases. я скажу, что тебе хорошо. А я французский садись. Удалось как-то ни с кем. Больше нету бензина, вот эти люди постоянно остаются с она будет заполнена, там не будет. Если они это будут делать здесь есть очень большой количество если бы все подчинили, прямо она была. Этого, скорее всего, не будет. Нет, этот договор сюда нужно. Но на этом не нужно. Нет, это место с ним. Palpable. Ну, это все видно, вот так вот. спецпосыл. Есть город, Одесса тоже. Одесса такая база. Одесса, там такая а что у нас еще есть крайний транспорт? Просто вот у меня Маша, которая все это Обуховская, но Обуховская туда тоже ехать или не надо? По ней ехать на Одессу тоже. Штаб ВМФ в Одессе, взяли, высадку. Как?
Одну секунду, одну секунду.
Идет военный конвой, а на другой стороне едет картечь. А ты? дальше она еще идет 40 километров. И Одесская трасса тоже. То есть все пытаются А дальше пойдет еще проблемы с мораторием и всем остальным. Стараются, когда еще красоту человечества. У нас полный набор сегодня.
делают, что могут. С тем, что им то и могут. Разрываются люди. Нет,
приехали утром еще.
Дело в том, что мы тут пока мы ехали в Киев, была точка, которая двигалась. Потому что мы подготовлены, мы постоянно пытаемся понять, когда мы проснулись. У нас 40 лет. Это проще. А он еще какой-то речь принес?
Да, он еще.
Я ее не слышал. Его речь я слышал, когда был исторический урок странный. Но вот эта речь очень. Ну, конечно, как заканчиваешь речь, все подобно по времени. Для некоторых встретить. Подождал конец Олимпийских игр. А Юра находится в городах. Хорошо, теперь у нас будет катастрофа за городом, потому что все эти люди сейчас выйдут и встанут без бензина. На этой же дороге. А мы забрали малого, собирались вывести, и он сказал, да, но мы когда же это 16, ну, не такой малый. Просто квартира в центре, подростка из квартиры, в которой он живет один, со своей социальной жизнью, за город очень сложно. Так как он компьютерщик, ну, когда мы вернемся в Рому, ну, тогда нужно еще взять компьютер, поэтому развернулись, здесь не ехали в машине. Развернулись, вернулись за компьютером в Киев. Но я с другой стороны знал, что в принципе ну, так не должно быть. Мы все делали быстро. А компьютер?
Российские дипломаты эвакуированы из Киева.
Что? Да, это все. Самое главное, чтобы между людьми еще сохранялась цивильность. Я очень надеюсь, что это сравнительно удобно. Все должны понимать ситуацию. Ты сидишь в своей машине, по своей семье, рядом с тобой сидит такая же ситуация. Я уже остыл.
Люди смотрят по сторонам, так
Ключ у тебя? Если тебе будет холодно, заведи, погрейся.
это холодно, потом вперед. Машина живет,
Он уже падал. Да, его с тех пор сделали.
как тогда?
Это тот мост, который сделал Кличко и сказал,
Мост упал, потому что мост упал.
единая редкость.
По-моему, да, все.
Всем людям хочется пить, есть, туалет. Серега, знаешь, как там двигались? Нет, вообще. Что в эту сторону плохо, там делать нечего, ну, кроме если мы бежим, а мы пока не бежим.
Бегать вообще.
Зачем нам бегать? Я никуда не бегу, я здесь живу. Ты пришел за мной. И что? How many times can you kill me? Only one. Okay. So if you kill me, okay. Это просто люди, которые с тобой уехали. Это не что. А все сыгралось на вот этом коротком промежутке времени, что я планировал их увезти и вернуться сам к нам. Я их везу, Артем говорит, блин, можно было забрать карман. Хорошо. Вот завернули, вернули и все. А сюда заехали, там, здесь были за 10 минут. Были. Мы дальше кого? Львова, границы, Польши, refugees, это уже поток. Вот. А за этим последует еще проблема голода. С чем связано? Инфраструктура не предвидена для того, чтобы вот эти люди могли бы питаться до этого места. Поэтому все, что есть съедобное, они съедят. А до этого был момент, который был очень странный, где из этого города увозили продукты. Увезли все стратегические запасы замороженного мяса, продали все зерно. Вы мне хотите сказать, это так случайно произошло? Это чисто случайно. Вот вы хотите сказать, что весь этот список 256 этапов пошел в путь? Я не верю. Я говорю, это все было спланировано заранее. Это продолжение шоу. А у нас просто нет программы. Мы узнаем по мере похода. Но признаки мы видим, когда мы начинаем их смотреть. Вот красивый кадр, это аппарат, вот эта колонна и сорока, которая сидит на поле. Давай. подняться сюда для тебя будет нереально. А если я спущусь на него, я, конечно, могу спуститься. Я к вам, я могу, скорость этой пробки, это медленнее.
Записывайте, как крысы уезжают.
Крысы. Отлично. Что, они все записаны добровольцы? Хотелось воевать? По-моему, эти люди просто хотели жить у себя дома. Что там было? 15 минут славы.
کاروان جان بۆ چی بۆی کەم بڵم چی یعنی
Я еще удивлен, что связь не вывели из строя. Когда будут приближаться, возможно, я вывести. Ось, мама. Отлично, я сюда приехал на работу, но я же тоже вот это несколько. Я потом поставил машину на другую сторону. Будем находиться. Что у тебя сейчас работает? Какой транспорт большой? Чуть правее сзади, красный дальше. Заправка. Там, вот перед ним я поставлю машину, когда пойдет вниз, поставлю машину с другой стороны. Да. Интересно, наш хозяин вам позвонит, чтобы повысить аренду или
пацаны есть, все готовы. А вот как это будет накарить? Системного оружия выпуска на ход, машина ломается, убивается, заканчивается.
The 8,968th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is a letter from the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations dated 13th April 2014 to the President of the Security Council S/2014/264. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. His Excellency, Mr. Mikko Kinnunen, Special Representative of the OSCE Chairperson in office in Ukraine and in the Trilateral Contact Group. His Excellency, Mr. Yashar Halitchevik, Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and Ms. Tatiana Montian, Ukrainian civil society activist. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I last briefed this Council on the situation in Ukraine as it relates to the implementation of the Minsk agreements on 11 February 2021. At that time, I drew attention to the fragile security situation that prevailed despite the nominal ceasefire in place. Today, a year since that briefing, tensions in and around Ukraine are running higher than at any point since 2014. Speculation and accusations around a potential military conflict are rife. Whatever one believes about the prospect of such a confrontation, the reality is that the current situation is extremely dangerous. The issues underpinning the current crisis are complex and long-standing. They tie together the 8-year conflict in eastern Ukraine with the larger issues related to European security architecture. Although seemingly intractable, given the stakes involved for our collective security and European stability, these issues can and must be solved through diplomacy in the full use of the many available regional and other mechanisms and frameworks. We support all such efforts, including through the Secretary General's good offices. Mr. President, regrettably, there's been little, if any, meaningful progress in the implementation of the various provisions of the Minsk agreements. Despite repeated efforts, the talks both in the Normandy 4 format and the discussions led by the Trilateral Contact Group remain deadlocked. We welcome the efforts of France and Germany to host the recent N4 discussions to break the current impasse and hope that these will continue. The Minsk agreements remain the only framework endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2202 for a negotiated peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. In this regard, we note with concern the reports of fresh ceasefire violations across the contact line over the past several hours. If verified, these violations must not be allowed to escalate further. We call on all sides to exercise maximum restraint at this time. We also call on all concerned to refrain from any unilateral measures that may go against the letter and spirit of the Minsk agreements or undermine their implementation and result in further tensions, including related to the status of certain areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. We commend the important work of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The Council will hear shortly from Ambassador Mikko Kinnunen, Special Representative of the OSCE's Chairperson in Office in Ukraine, and Ambassador Khalid Chevik, Chief Monitor of the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission. It's essential that we support their work, particularly at this critical time. The Special Monitoring Mission, which carries out its crucial functions despite considerable challenges, must enjoy safe and secure conditions. Mr. President, on 14 February, the Secretary General expressed his deep worry regarding a potential military conflict in Europe. He reminded the international community that the price in human suffering, destruction, and damage to European and global security is too high to contemplate. The Secretary General has remained fully engaged with key actors, including the governments of the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and has reiterated the same unambiguous message. There is no alternative to diplomacy. It's incumbent on all member states to fully respect the key principles of the United Nations Charter, to settle disputes by peaceful means, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. In this regard, let me restate the commitment of the United Nations to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, as called for in GA resolutions. The recent diplomatic contacts, including between heads of state, are welcome. But more needs to be done urgently, including tangible steps on the ground and an end to inflammatory rhetoric to diffuse tensions. Mr. President, as we have done throughout the 8 years of the conflict, the United Nations continues to stand with the people of Ukraine. The UN country team in Ukraine remains fully operational. Our humanitarian colleagues are committed to providing assistance in accordance with the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. This includes, for example, 3 humanitarian convoys that delivered over 140 metric tons of life-saving assistance across the contact line since the start of 2022, benefiting thousands of people in need. It's imperative that safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian actors is respected by all sides under any circumstances. Amid the current tensions, we should not lose sight of the existing dire humanitarian needs impacting 2.9 million people, with the majority living in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine. Donor support has allowed us to provide aid to over 1.5 million people during the first 9 months of 2021, the highest level since 2017. This critical achievement must be sustained amid the increasing severity of humanitarian needs. Early and adequate funding of the $190 million 2022 humanitarian response plan is needed to continue to meet the urgent needs of 1.8 million vulnerable people, including over 1 million in government-controlled areas and 750,000 in non-government controlled areas. Mr. President, for the war-weary people of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts, the impact of COVID-19 on top of the conflict has caused even more grave disruption and suffering. Millions of people who prior to the pandemic could still maintain family and community connectivity have been unable to travel freely across the contact line due to COVID-19 related restrictions. As a consequence of their increased isolation and abrupt loss of access to basic services and livelihoods, the needs of this already vulnerable population have been exacerbated. At the same time, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights continues to document civilian casualties and the impact of hostilities, monitor freedom of movement, and receive and report on allegations of human rights violations. Despite the persistent tensions, last year saw the lowest number of civilian casualties documented by OHCHR since the beginning of the conflict. Overall adherence to the ceasefire has been an important factor in this trend. It must continue. Mr. President, over 14,000 people have already lost their lives in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. As the Secretary General said this week, we simply cannot accept even the possibility of a new conflict in Ukraine. Indeed, we are facing a test. The world is looking to the collective security mechanisms in Europe, but also to this Council to help ease tensions and ensure that the only skirmishes will be diplomatic. We cannot afford to fail. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah.
I think Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mikko Kinnunen.
The TCG supports implementation of the settlement provided by the Minsk agreements. However, in times like these, it is impossible to address the Donbas issue without paying attention to the bigger context, which is the tense security situation around Ukraine and in the region, as well as the intensive high-level diplomacy. Arguably, this bigger context has a strong interlinkage with the work of the Trilateral Contact Group. This argument is based on views according to which finding a solution to the main task of the TCG, implementation of the Minsk agreements, could help in solving many of the issues of the bigger picture. However, presently, positions of the participants to the discussions of the TCG are too far from each other. Consequently, as of now, it is not yet possible to solve the conflict related to eastern Ukraine within the TCG. We need to continue our work. At the same time, it is important to note that all the elements of the three Minsk agreements are relevant and need to be addressed. These agreements, Minsk Protocol, Minsk Memorandum, and the Minsk package of measures continue to form the basis of our work. It is crucial that all sides will continue to remain committed. It is popular to accuse one or another participant to the discussions for violating Minsk agreements or for not wanting to implement Minsk agreements. Here, my message would suggest caution. The fact is that none of the elements of the Minsk agreements has been implemented, or at least fully implemented. Furthermore, in my experience, it is not possible nor appropriate to single out only one party for being responsible for this. Everyone involved in the discussions of the trilateral contact group needs to bear their responsibility for carrying out what has been agreed. We need more flexible positions and readiness to compromise. Mr. President, security situation along the 480 kilometers long contact line that separates government-controlled area from the non-government controlled area of eastern Ukraine is one of the key focuses of the work of the TCG. In the present situation, particularly with reference to the bigger contexts, it is important to continue to stay calm also along the contact line. Provocations are to be avoided. At the end of the day, no one would benefit from new military activities. Concrete press example of a potentially provocative situation is the alleged shelling that occurred this morning in Luhansk region, close to the contact line. It is important to try to establish facts in a swift manner and to avoid escalation. One participant to the discussions of the TCG has requested for an extraordinary TCG meeting. Armed conflict related to eastern Ukraine is 8 years old, as referred by the Undersecretary General. The conflict continues, has resulted in over 14,000 victims, hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees. Crossings over the contact line have dropped, civilian crossings, by 95% since the closing of checkpoints 2 years ago, resulting in additional civilian suffering and hardship. Conflict-affected areas with ongoing military activities have sadly become part of everyday life for countless Ukrainian citizens. In late December 2021, 2 months ago, participants to the discussions of the trilateral contact group agreed fully to adhere to the ceasefire agreement of July 2020. This New Year's commitment 2 months ago did not hold well enough. However, the positive side of the matter was, for 1 month period following the commitment, there were 70% less ceasefire violations than during the month before. This once again indicates if there is political will, it is possible not to use arms, possible not to fire. True, there have been small positive steps with our work, such as creation of an environmental expert group. Recent IAEA visit to the non-government controlled area shows that when there is will on all sides, agreeing is possible. But clearly, not enough progress has been made. One reason to this are status-related issues that may, from the outside, appear procedural, but are actually part of the core substance. Mr. President, Excellencies, during this week, the State Duma of the Russian Federation approved a resolution calling upon the Russian president to recognize independence of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This has caused questions and internal discussion within the TCG. While I know that the Duma resolution does not reflect the official line of the government, it is important to emphasize that all participants need to remain committed to the goal of restoring Ukraine's sovereignty over the totality of its territory. At the same time, the big context, the bigger picture, the unprecedented international focus on Ukraine and the region should be used as an opportunity to intensify, to unblock the work of the TCG. I am grateful for the recent high-level contacts between the leaders of the Normandy 4, as well as the two meetings of the Normandy 4 political advisors, and, for example, of the OSCE chairman in office discussions in Kyiv and Moscow during the past days. These all could give new impetus to unblock TCG's work. They could, for example, to give us an opportunity to have and focus, to have substantial discussions on certain concrete draft laws at the very heart of the Minsk agreements. Finally, TCG has now met in video format in online meetings almost for 2 years. Meetings in video format lack drive and confidentiality. For several reasons, they do not offer possibilities for genuine negotiations and interaction. My goal remains to return to face-to-face meetings of our unique platform that does bring together Ukraine, Russia, the OSCE, as well as representatives of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kinnunen for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Yashar Halit-Chevik.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to brief this Council today. In my capacity as the Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine and as the Coordinator of the Working Group on Security Issues in the Trilateral Group, I will update you on key developments on the situation in eastern Ukraine during the past year. These include the security situation along the contact line, the impact of nearly 8 years of the conflict on civilians, and the SMM's increasingly challenging operational environment. The security situation remains fraught with tension. The gradual frame of the ceasefire I described to the Council last February has regrettably accelerated, and inevitably, civilians on both sides of the contact line continue to bear the burden of the tensions and resulting insecurity. I further have to note with deep concern that the impediments to the SMM's mandated freedom of movement have not only persisted but escalated in the past year. In times of heightened tensions in and around Ukraine, when the mission's impartial and objective reporting is vital, these restrictions are especially unacceptable since they limit the mission's capabilities. The SMM has been vilified in public rhetoric, and mission members have at times been intimidated. Our technical monitoring tools are subjected to intense interference daily. The mission suffered temporary blockades of operations in Donetsk region last October. In Luhansk region, the SMM is also subjected to a blockade. SMM's sustainability is under risk as it has been deprived of its operational freedom and independence. In this context, I also wish to highlight my concern with the fact that the contact line remains exceedingly difficult to cross, both for SMM and civilians. It increasingly looks like and feels like a border, which it transects and divides families and communities and provision of services. Before elaborating on these developments, I wish to stress that in such challenging circumstances, the political will of the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire and reduce tensions is imperative. Silence along the contact line is of utmost importance for allowing space for negotiations. Abstaining from inflammatory public rhetoric is also essential. Mr. President, since I last briefed the esteemed Council, the overall security situation along the contact line in eastern Ukraine has remained volatile. After the unprecedented period of relative calm that followed the 22nd July 2020 Trilateral Contact Group Agreement on measures to strengthen the ceasefire throughout 2021, we saw a gradual but sustained increase in the level of armed violence. In 2021, between August and December in particular, the mission recorded high numbers of ceasefire violations, including increased use of heavy weapons that the sides had committed to withdraw, as well as their consequences in civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. In November, the SMM recorded levels of kinetic activity, including the more destructive weapons, worryingly close to those recorded prior to July 22nd Measures Agreement. At the 22nd December 2021 TCG meeting, the participants expressed strong determination to uphold the ceasefire regime. The first month following that meeting saw a considerable decrease in the level of violence by some 60%. But tensions nevertheless remain high, fueled also by the wider discussions surrounding the security situation in and around Ukraine. Of serious concern is the fact that in 2021, the SMM recorded ceasefire violations in and near the three symbolically important pilot disengagement areas, including with the use of proscribed weapons. In Luhansk region, in particular, the wider Pervomaisk, Popasna, Zolote area consistently remained a hotspot. On 3 December, the SMM recorded a violent exchange of fire inside and near the Stanitska-Luhansk disengagement and crossing point. This was an especially dangerous situation as civilians in transit, including children, were put at risk. This was the first time since April 2020 that SMM recorded ceasefire violations inside this area. Importantly, there, the benefits of this engagement had been clearly demonstrated as it allowed for the reconstruction of the Stanitska-Luhansk bridge, one of the symbols of this conflict. I underline the significance of violence in these three areas as it provides insight into the side's will, or at times its absence, to adhere to their commitments. In this context, I also wish to share my deep concern over the side's holding of live fire exercises inside the security zone throughout 2021 and since the start of 2022. These ceasefire violations deserve our particular attention as they violate both the comprehensive ceasefire regime and the specific TCG decision of 3 March 2016 prohibiting the conduct of such exercises. Last month, they were approximately 10% of all ceasefire violations recorded by the SMM. Since the beginning of 2022, the mission is already recording on average twice as many ceasefire violations per day as it did over the same period in 2021, when the sides' adherence to the ceasefire had already started fraying. As I noted, the increasing levels of violence with the use of heavy weapons inevitably led to a rise in the number of corroborated civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire. In 2021, the SMM corroborated more civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire, 48, than those caused by mines and other explosive objects. Nearly 60% of the corroborated civilian casualties as a result of shelling and small arms fire, as well as nearly 70% of all cases of damage to civilian objects and the infrastructure sites were recorded between October and November last year. Other violations of commitments undertaken by the sides have also continued. The SMM recorded new trench extensions and improvements to positions, the presence of heavy weapons and military-type positions in residential areas, and the increased use of non-SMM unmanned aerial vehicles. As a last point on this issue, it is worth mentioning that violations occur on either side of the contact line. Mr. President, regrettably, discussions in the working group on security issues have been at an impasse for the past year. In principle agreements reached in 2020 on 19 demining areas, an updated mine action plan, 4 new disengagement areas, and a draft addendum to clarify some aspects of the framework decision on disengagement have not been actioned. The security-related conclusions of the 2019 Normandy 4 Paris Summit require new political impetus to be translated into tangible progress. Since April 2021, participants have been discussing a draft addendum to the 22nd July measures agreement, but common ground has yet to be found. As I underlined last year, such mechanism would facilitate the escalation, address the persistent issue of impunity, and contribute to building confidence on the ground. It will demonstrate the sides' political will to act in line with their commitments. Mr. President, I wish to underline that the communities along the contact line are deeply traumatized by living in constant danger and uncertainty. I already mentioned the 48 casualties caused by small arms fire or shelling. In 2021, the SMM corroborated another 43 cases of people injured or killed by mines, unexploded ordnance, and other explosive devices. It is imperative that the sides do their utmost to mitigate these constant threats, even unilaterally, in parallel with the negotiations on overall solutions. Mr. President, the challenges of the ongoing pandemic have also endured and continue to make daily life even more challenging for civilians on both sides of the contact line. The past year saw no improvement in civilians' freedom of movement between the government and non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. Crossing the contact line remains limited to 2 of the 5 existing crossing points. Only the pedestrian crossing at Staniska Luhansk Bridge is accessible on a daily basis. There has been no progress in opening of the 2 new crossings at Zolote and Shastia, even though in principle agreement on their opening was reached in July 2020. Even as some of the pandemic-related restrictions were eased last year, official data shows that crossings in 2021 remain a mere 5% of the pre-pandemic levels. These are not just statistics, they represent the elderly who can no longer access their pensions, as well as the young who are losing out on educational and economic opportunities. Access to other services, including healthcare and documentation, such as passports, birth and death certificates, is being severely curtailed, while people, family, friends, communities are being separated from each other. Estrangement between communities spanning the contact line should not become entrenched. The needs and the rights of civilians should take precedence. Both existing and new crossing points should be fully opened and all restrictions on both sides of the contact line lifted without delay. In these challenging circumstances, it is also vital that critical infrastructure that civilians depend on for their basic needs remain operational and protected from the impact of armed violence. Last year, the SMM continued facilitating and monitoring repairs to gas, water, and electricity infrastructure objects, benefiting millions of civilians on both sides of the contact line. Regrettably, since February 2021, and especially in the wake of an incident inside the disengagement area near Zolote in October, the process of exchanging security guarantees among the sides has been at an impasse, particularly in Luhansk region. I would like to underline that the exchange of security guarantees, which are essential for conducting vital repairs, had previously not been linked to increased tensions on the ground. This process should not be politicized as it is done now. Mr. President, reviewing these challenges, it appears to me that there has never been a greater need for impartial and objective monitoring delivered by SMM. The sides also recognize the importance of the mission's work. Their reactions to the temporary relocation of some mission members last weekend clearly indicated that. Throughout the past year, the SMM has continued managing the challenges I described and performing its mandated tasks. However, since I last briefed this council, the mission's work has continued to be undermined by persistent and escalating constraints on its freedom of movement, predominantly in areas outside government control. I need to underline that freedom of movement is what makes monitoring as foreseen in the mandate. It is essential for enabling the SMM to serve as an impartial eye and ear of the international community in Ukraine. I wish to recall that this freedom of movement is enshrined in the mission's mandate as well as in Minsk agreements. In 2021, some 91% of all freedom of movement restrictions experienced by SMM took place in non-government controlled areas. The past year saw missions movements across the contact line increasingly denied, delayed, and conditioned. These impediments continued to undermine the SMM's operational unity and threaten the sustainability of its work in non-government controlled areas. Impediments to SMM's use of technical monitoring tools have also continued on both sides of the contact line. Instances of gunfire assessed as targeting SMM's unmanned aerial vehicles almost doubled. The intensity of GPS signal interference in 2021 reached unusually high levels. The degradation of our aerial environment in 2021 particularly affected the SMM's long-range railways. This platform is the only one that can monitor the full length of the contact line and the areas near the border outside government control 24/7 basis. However, over 80% of the flights encountered interference. Mr. President, the past year has been difficult on many levels. At a time of heightened tensions on the ground and in public rhetoric, it is imperative for the signatories of the Minsk agreements to adhere to all their commitments, first and foremost among them, to strictly adhere to ceasefire regime. Political impasse and increased violence reinforce one another. I hope that the recent resumption of the Normandy 4 consultations and other confidence-building efforts under the auspices of the OSCE will provide much-needed political impetus to relieve tensions in the region and for conflict resolution process to move forward. The restoration of SMM's freedom of movement is meanwhile paramount in order that the mission can do its job. The SMM should be actively supported by the sides in installing new cameras and opening long-planned forward patrol bases. The SMM should again be able to cross the contact line without arbitrary conditioning and denials. Its unimpeded and unconditional access through the contact line, especially in Luhansk region, must be restored without delay. Attempts to vilify the mission by public accusing of accusing it of bias, should also come to an end. The impasse in exchange of security guarantees among the sides also requires urgent resolution all along the contact line. The capacity on the ground exists, the will to use it needs to be strengthened and be guided solely by the needs of the long-suffering civilians. The SMM remains available to facilitate constructive efforts in this regard. Mr. President, before concluding my remarks, I would like to highlight 2 points. I remain convinced that the SMM's role remains critical to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability and security. Yet, our key challenge has been to ensure the space for the implementation of that mandate. Lacking any way to enforce this implementation, we need the strong and sustained support of the international community to urge the sides to implement their commitments and restore SMM's freedom of movement. Where there is a political will, there is a way, and I remember particularly the reconstruction of the Stanska-Luhansk bridge after so many years and the encouraging periods of quiet that briefly followed the July 22nd measures agreement. Progress is possible. I'm also compelled to highlight the continuing plight of civilians. I have described the death and injury caused by continued exchanges of fire and by mines. However, allow me to also no fault of their own. This is taking place against the background of other developments that are further deepening the divide between people living on both sides of the contact line. The political challenges of this 8-year conflict should not eclipse the human cost. I implore the signatories of the Minsk agreements to be mindful of these costs and redouble their efforts. I also urge the members of this venerable council to work with the sides and support their efforts to that end. If you allow me, Mr. President, I would also like to give some information about the developments of today's morning hours. Between yesterday evening and 11:20 Kyiv today, Kyiv time today, the SMM has recorded 500 explosions along the contact line. The wider areas of disengagement areas near Stanska-Luhansk, Zolote were particularly kinetic. After 11:20, we have recorded about 30 explosions, so the tension may seem to be easy. During the early hours, around noon, the SMM has asked the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire commitments. It is critically important to de-escalate immediately to avoid further aggravation of the situation. SMM is aware and is following up on the reports of civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, and all along the contact line during the last 24 hours. We will continue to follow up the security situation as much as our resources allow, of course. The increased kinetic activity happened along roughly 200 kilometers of the contact line, basically on the Luhansk Oblast, and many SMM patrols are still returning and in the process of reporting. SMM patrols have visited the sites of the alleged damage to kindergarten and railway station in the government-controlled part of Stanska-Luhansk. At the kindergarten, the SMM saw fresh damage to its facade. Of course, the details will be reported after all the corroboration effort has been completed, and we will do it as soon as possible because we are aware of the importance of these reports in reducing the tensions in the area. In Marinka and Karamchuk, where there were allegations, SMM itself didn't register ceasefire violations, and we are going to follow up. We are actually following up the allegations that reached to us. But it is important that the sides are called to reduce tensions and ceasefire, and also they do themselves being mindful of the high tensions in the region. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Chevik for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Tetiana Montian.
Thank you, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. This is the technician. Can you please unmute your microphone? Ma'am, your microphone is still muted. Please unmute your microphone.
Слышно?
We can hear
Теперь
you now.
слышно, да? Еще раз добрый день.
Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope you can hear me. I listened very carefully to everything that was said by the speakers before me, and I would like to say to you this. I am completely certain that you all know very well that never, ever, ever the authorities in Kyiv had the intention of implementing either the first package of Minsk agreements and much less so the second Minsk agreements. This is simply a pause to be able to say, yes, we're going to implement that. In the meantime, we'll receive weapons from NATO, our armed forces will become stronger, and we do hope that in some time later, we will be able to get back the rebellious republics by force. It's not only they do not want to talk to the republics, and this was said by Zelensky directly just now. He said that he sees no reason to have dialogue with Donetsk and Luhansk. They do not want to have conversations with the civil society, even within Ukraine. People who do not want to go to Europe or NATO, people who are against the coup d'etat, who want to live in peace and friendship in Russia and other countries. These people, not only are they not represented within Ukrainian politics at all, they are being criminally prosecuted. I'm a criminal lawyer. Ruslan Kataba simply posted a video on YouTube saying that he is in favor of peace and against war in Donbass. And he has been on trial since 2015, and the accusation is high treason. I went to Donbass personally to visit one of the commanders, now dead, Mr. Moskovy, so as to take a detainee back. And I saw a huge number of people whose only fault is that they're against Maidan, against coup d'etat, against NATO and Europe. And you now want to tell me that those people who sit in judgment over other peoples because they have placed a like in social networks, people who closed all opposition channels, who are prosecuting all opposition politics, that these people are going to hold conversation with Donetsk and Luhansk, it is very clear that this is in principle a possibility. This is a matter and antimatter. They annihilate each other. So what is the problem? What was the difficulty to provide a special status in the past 5 years? They are not going to do that because any different thinking in Ukraine is being squashed. People who are in Ukraine against Maidan, against a coup d'etat, against war, the enemies of the people. They have no right to take the floors anywhere at all. They have no political parties. They have no civil society associations. They have no right to speak in their country. They don't have that right at all. And of course, even after that, how can you ask that Kyiv be talking to Lugansk and Donetsk? I am sure you understand that this will never, ever, ever happen. One of the previous speakers said, that I regret that despite the efforts of Germany and France, the Kyiv regime does not want to implement the Kyiv agreements. I'm certain that the West allows the Kyiv regime to non-implement. If this were not the case, all of the Minsk agreements would have been implemented a long time ago. Please do not say that Kyiv is an independent entity here, that Ukraine is independent. It is a colony of a collective West, where everything is decided by the people who came in from the outside, who organized the Maidan and the coup d'etat and plunged my country into slavery. And these are the same people stand in the way of implementing the Minsk agreement. And they will not allow the agreements to be implemented. I'm certain of it, because the real goal of the West, despite all the peace-loving speeches I've heard, including here, is to make sure that Kyiv attacks the republics and that Russia is bogged into this war. No explanation for the Western hysterics when they say that Russia is about to invade. And Biden just said, I just listened to it as we were having this meeting. That's what he said. There is no other goal that the West has. The only goal is to organize war. If this were not the case, then the puppet government of Ukraine would have been compelled to implement the Minsk agreements a long time ago. And since this is not taking place, then we can state one thing and one thing only. The West wants a war with Russia. And it wants a war to take place on the territory of Ukraine. We are not a chessboard. We are a people of Ukraine. And the people in the unrecognized republics are simply pawns in political games. There's nothing else that can be said here. And I am sure that you yourselves understand that very well. I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to say this to your face. I am convinced that you will lead the events to a war. The events today in the republics when they were shelled throughout the contact line have convinced me of that completely. Ukraine, the Kyiv regime, for almost 8 years have been shelling about 100,000 people using heavy artillery. OSCE have the moniker of blind observers in the territories react to this not at all. That side which is under the control of the Kyiv regime, children are not killed. Not a single child has been killed, and buildings are standing up. This only happens in the unrecognized republic, and I visited them personally. I am telling you this about firsthand because I traveled down the entire contact line, and I saw how peaceful civilians, unprotected, vulnerable people are being killed. The people who did not manage to leave their old old people, the women with children, or they're handicapped. Those who could have left the area a long time ago. So these long-suffering people are hostages there, and they're in the number of 100,000. And the entire Europe is, for the 8th year running, looking duplicitously at the suffering of these people, whilst at the same time saying that there is no alternative to the Minsk agreements. Well, fine, then compel your marionettes from the Kyiv regime to implement them, and please, or stop saying that there is no alternative to them. I thank you for your attention. I thank Ms. Tatiana Manchan for her briefing. I will now make a statement in my capacity as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. We would like to thank for their assessments and views Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, Special Representative of the OSCE Chairperson in office in Ukraine in the Trilateral Contact Group, and the Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Session, Mr. Chevik. And we are grateful to Ms. Tatiana Manchan for her valuable information firsthand about how the Security Council decisions on implementing inter-Ukrainian conflict are being implemented in practice. The date of the meeting today is not random. This is a day when 7 years ago the Security Council of the United Nations passed Resolution 2202, and it unanimously adopted the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement as the only international legal basis to settle the civil conflict in the east of Ukraine. And that is why the main goal for the meeting today we see in reaffirming by the Security Council of the fact that there is no alternative to this momentous for Ukraine document. Unfortunately, 7 years down the road, we are increasingly thinking that the implementation of the Minsk agreements is not something that's in the plans of our Ukrainian neighbors. They're stating that openly now. Let me give you some examples. As recently as yesterday, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, Irina Vereshchuk, stated that there will be no new laws on the special status of Donbass or no direct agreements. And this took place after Zelensky had a meeting with Chancellor Scholz. She also acknowledged that there is no pressure exerted by West on them to implement the Minsk agreements. On the 4th of February, there was an interview by the Ukrainian channel 1+1 by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kuleba. He said that the Minsk agreement cannot be implemented on Russian terms, and in those terms he thinks is a direct dialogue between Ukraine and Donbass, despite the fact that this is clearly stated in the package of measures. This same idea was expressed by the head of Ukrainian presidential administration, Yermak, at the recent meeting in Normandy. Earlier, on the 2nd of February, Mr. Kuleba said that no Ukrainian region will have a veto right on the state decision. This is cast in stone, so there will be no special status, as Russia says, no veto. One day earlier, on the 1st of February, Zelensky also recalled for the world entire of Ukraine's inability to negotiate. He hinted at an alternative solution to the conflict in Donbass and says that Kyiv has a different view to the order of the implementing the provisions of the Minsk agreement. On the 31st of January, in the interview to the Associated Press, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council stated that the implementation of the Minsk agreement means destroying of the country. They were signed at the barrel of Russian guns, and Germans and the French looked on, and every rational person understood that the implementation is impossible. Ukrainian politics are trying to implant the opinion in the West that the Minsk agreements are against the national interest of Ukraine. But if the goal of building peace on their own land is part of the national interest of Ukraine, well, such statements are out of place. Another excuse that we hear here is that Russia is not implementing some of its obligations in the Minsk agreements. And it is very possible that this is something that we'll also hear today. At the same time, it's obvious that there are absolutely no grounds for that, because there is no mention of Russia in the text of the Minsk agreements. Let me just give you one opinion on this, not by anyone, but by a judge from the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. He very recently proposed opening criminal prosecution against those who participated in the working out of Minsk agreements, Leonid Kuchma and Petro Poroshenko. And the reason, he says, and I quote, Minsk provides for 20 obligations placed on Ukraine, 6 on OSCE, 2 on Donbass, and not a single one for Russia. End of quote. Colleagues, please allow me to, yet once again, very briefly recall the contents of the document we're discussing at this meeting of ours. Let me list it item by item, and the order in which they are to be implemented is very clearly stated. It cannot be changed. First, ceasefire. Second, withdrawal of weapons. 3, OSCE monitoring. 4, launching a dialogue between Kyiv and Donbass. 5, amnesty. 6, exchange of detainees. 7, humanitarian access. 8, lifting the economic blockade. 9, transfer to the Kyiv border control provided item 11 is implemented. 10, withdrawal of foreign formations and mercenaries. 11, new constitutions providing special status for Donbass. 12, agreeing on the order of conducting elections. And 13, intensifying the work of the contact group in Minsk. 7 years down the road, it is clear that none of the provisions of the package of measures have been implemented by Ukraine in full. Starting with the first one, ceasefire. And the root of the problem here is systematic lack of desire of Kyiv to get into a direct dialogue with the authorized representative of Donetsk and Luhansk in the contact group. Whereas this is a dialogue that is clearly directly provided in items 4, 9, 11, and 12 of the document. This is not our requirement. This is something that is stated in the document. It's an obligation on Ukraine. And this is something that our neighbors increasingly bring into question, and thus risk undermine the whole Minsk process, which could lead to devastating consequences for Ukraine. Ukraine stubbornly refuses to implement the provisions of the Minsk on direct dialogue with Donbass, interim self-governance, restoring socioeconomic links, constitutional reform. And currently, the Verkhovnaya Rada has a draft on decentralization. It's not agreed with Donbass, and it does not provide for a special status. Ukrainian side has taken course to completely move away from a direct interaction with Donbass within the coordination mechanism, and they are providing various options, but they do not allow for effective reaction in case there are violations. Attempts to place the blame on Russia are futile and baseless, and this only hides the goal of shifting the blame away from Ukraine. I must say that we are very disappointed by the ostrich-like position of our Western colleagues who are trying not to see obvious things. We are surprised that they're putting into the shadow the Minsk complex of measures, but they are placing the emphasis on the Normand format. I'd like to recall the Normand format, according to Annex 2 of the resolution, is a mechanism to control implementation, but not a place where new decisions could be discussed. For 7 years, Russia has been calling in all platforms for the Western sponsors to exert pressure on Kyiv to implement the Minsk agreements. They were doing exactly the opposite. So the increasing feeling of impunity pushed the Ukrainian hotheads to new excuses and military adventures against their own people. And this is what we have. We have thousands of victims of the internal armed conflict. Many millions in Donbass are still presented as foreigners in their own country. They have automatic rifles, sniper rifles, howitzers, and strike drones targeted at them. Ukrainian representatives keep coming up with new excuses not to implement their agreements. And order to shell their own people. There is an Alley of Angels, a memorial complex in Donetsk to commemorate the children who died at the hands of Ukrainian military. Those who died at the children's beach in Zurgus on the 13th of August. It was targeted by the Air Force of Ukraine. 20 people died, dozens were wounded. A 24-year-old Anastasia Rubin, a local, was there with her son at the time when the Ukrainian Air Force started shelling the town from their multiple rocket launch system. One of the charges exploded right next to them. Everything was covered in blood and smoke and bloodied bodies of children. This and other similar episodes were compiled by the Investigative Committee of Russia and the RT Media in a compilation showing the Ukrainian military using prohibited means or ways of means. And our UN mission have compiled that and disseminated this to members of the Security Council. Please take a look at them. You will be horrified by them. The Kyiv's commitment to the complex of measures can also be illustrated by the abduction last year in Lugansk from the Joint Center on Congregation Control of Andrea Cossack. Mr. Kinnunen, we would be very grateful if you could tell us about this episode. This is a treacherous event, and it is a direct violation of Item 5 of the conflict measures, which prohibits the prosecution and punishment of persons in connection with the events in Donetsk and Luhansk. Colleagues, I would like to finally say that you will be able to resist the temptation to play to the cameras and will not make this meeting of ours into a circus, will not present here baseless accusations saying that Russia allegedly was going to attack Ukraine. I think we've had enough speculation on that, including the Security Council meeting on the 31st of January convened by the United States. We have long ago clarified everything and explained everything, and the announced date of the so-called invasion is behind us. So therefore, my advice to you is not present yourself in an awkward situation. I thank you for your attention. And now I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Mr. President, this council was convened today to discuss the implementation of the Minsk agreements, a goal that we all share, despite Russia's persistent violations. These agreements, which were negotiated in 2014 and 2015 and signed by Russia, remain the basis for the peace process to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This council's primary responsibility, the very reason for its creation, is the preservation of peace and security. As we meet today, the most immediate threat to peace and security is Russia's looming aggression against Ukraine. The stakes go far beyond Ukraine. This is a moment of peril for the lives and safety of millions of people, as well as for the foundation of the United Nations Charter and the rules-based international order that preserves stability worldwide. This crisis directly affects every member of this council and every country in the world. Because the basic principles that sustain peace and security, principles that were enshrined in the wake of 2 world wars and a Cold War, are under threat. The principle that one country cannot change the borders of another by force. The principle that one country cannot dictate another's choices or policies or with whom it will associate. The principle of national sovereignty. This is the exact kind of crisis that the United Nations, and specifically this Security Council, was created to prevent. We must address what Russia is doing right now to Ukraine. Over the past months, without provocation or justification, Russia has amassed more than 150,000 troops around Ukraine's borders, in Russia, Belarus, occupied Crimea. Russia says it's drawing down those forces. We do not see that happening on the ground. Our information indicates clearly that these forces, including ground troops, aircraft, ships, are preparing to launch an attack against Ukraine in the coming days. We don't know precisely how things will play out, but here's what the world can expect to see unfold. In fact, it's unfolding right now, today, as Russia takes steps down the path to war and reissued the threat of military action. First, Russia plans to manufacture a pretext for its attack. This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government. We don't know exactly the form it will take. It could be a fabricated so-called terrorist bombing inside Russia, the invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike against civilians, or a fake, even a real, attack using chemical weapons. Russia may describe this event as ethnic cleansing or a genocide, making a mockery of a concept that we in this chamber do not take lightly, nor do I take lightly, based on my family history. In the past few days, Russian media has already begun to spread some of these false alarms and claims to maximize public outrage, to lay the groundwork for an invented justification for war. Today, that drumbeat has only intensified in Russia's state-controlled media. We've heard some of these basic allegations from Russian-backed speakers here today. Second, in response to this manufactured provocation, the highest levels of the Russian government may theatrically convene emergency meetings to address the so-called crisis. The government will issue proclamations declaring that Russia must respond to defend Russian citizens or ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Next, the attack is planned to begin. Russian missiles and bombs will drop across Ukraine. Communications will be jammed. Cyber attacks will shut down key Ukrainian institutions. After that, Russian tanks and soldiers will advance on key targets that have already been identified and mapped out in detailed plans. We believe these targets include Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million people. And conventional attacks are not all that Russia plans to inflict upon the people of Ukraine. We have information that indicates Russia will target specific groups of Ukrainians. We've been warning the Ukrainian government of all that is coming. And here today, we are laying it out in great detail with the hope that by sharing what we know with the world, we can influence Russia to abandon the path of war and choose a different path while there's still time. Now, I'm mindful that some have called into question our information, recalling previous instances where intelligence ultimately did not bear out. But let me be clear. I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one. The information I presented here is validated by what we've seen unfolding in plain sight before our eyes for months. And remember that while Russia has repeatedly derided our warnings and alarms as melodrama and nonsense, they have been steadily amassing more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, as well as the capabilities to conduct a massive military assault. It isn't just us seeing this. Allies and partners see the same thing. And Russia hasn't only been hearing from us. The international chorus has grown louder and louder. If Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, then we will be relieved that Russia changed course and proved our predictions wrong. That would be a far better outcome than the course we're currently on. And we'll gladly accept any criticism that anyone directs at us. As President Biden said, this would be a war of choice. And if Russia makes that choice, we've been clear, along with allies and partners, that our response will be sharp and decisive. President Biden reiterated that forcefully earlier this week. There's another choice Russia can still make, if there's any truth to its claim that it's committed to diplomacy. Diplomacy is the only responsible way to resolve this crisis. An essential part of this is through implementation of the Minsk agreements, the subject of our session today. There are a series of commitments that Russia and Ukraine made under Minsk, with the OSCE and the Normandy format partners involved as well. If Russia is prepared to sit with the Ukrainian government and work through the process of implementing these commitments, our friends in France and Germany stand ready to convene senior-level discussions in the Normandy format to settle these issues. Ukraine is ready for this, and we stand fully ready to support the parties. Progress toward resolving the Donbass crisis through the Minsk agreements can reinforce the broader discussions on security issues that we're prepared to engage in with Russia, in coordination with our allies and partners. More than 3 weeks ago, we provided Russia with a paper that detailed concrete reciprocal steps that we can take in the near term to address our respective concerns and advance the collective security interests of Russia, the United States, and our European partners and allies. This morning, we received a response, which we're evaluating. Earlier today, I sent a letter to Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, proposing that we meet next week in Europe, following on our talks in recent weeks, to discuss the steps that we can take to resolve this crisis without conflict. We're also proposing meetings of the NATO-Russia Council and the OSCE Permanent Council. These meetings can pave the way for a summit of key leaders in the context of de-escalation to reach understandings on our mutual security concerns. As lead diplomats for our nations, we have a responsibility to make every effort for diplomacy to succeed, to leave no diplomatic stone unturned. If Russia is committed to diplomacy, we're presenting every opportunity for it to demonstrate that commitment. I have no doubt that the response to my remarks here today will be more dismissals from the Russian government about the United States stoking hysteria or that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. So let me make this simple. The Russian government can announce today, with no qualification, equivocation, or deflection, that Russia will not invade Ukraine. State it clearly, state it plainly to the world, and then demonstrate it by sending your troops, your tanks, your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and sending your diplomats to the negotiating table. In the coming days, the world will remember that commitment, or the refusal to make it. I yield the floor.
I thank His Excellency, Secretary of State of the United States, Mr. Blinken, and I now give the floor to Minister of State for Europe and North America of the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Mr. James Cleverly.
I thank you, and I thank the briefers for the information they've given today. The United Nations, the OSCE, and the mandate of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission continue to command our full support. The rights of all Ukrainian, whether they are in Kyiv, Lviv, Donetsk, Luhansk, can only be served by peace, diplomacy, and dialogue. I want to make absolutely clear the United Kingdom's support for the implementation of the Minsk agreements as endorsed by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. That resolution reaffirmed the Security Council's full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It remains the responsibility of all parties to implement fully their commitments and to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In this respect, we condemn the actions taken by the Russian Duma to propose the Russian president recognize the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent. This would directly undermine the Minsk agreements and must be rejected by the Russian authorities in line with the commitments that they have made. We welcome all efforts to support the process and to avoid escalation, including the role of the OSCE and the Normandy format. This remains our long-standing position. Mr. President, let us remind ourselves of the context for the Minsk agreements and the situation in which Ukraine finds itself today. In March 2014, Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea in flagrant violation of international law. A few weeks later, in April, Russia instigated a conflict in the Donbass, which it continues to fuel today. More than 14,000 people have lost their lives in the fighting there. Now, today, the Ukrainian people are yet again living under the threat of invasion, with well over 130,000 Russian troops, heavy weaponry and military vessels amassed and exercising on their northern, eastern and southern borders from Belarus to the Black Sea. Let us say clearly what the whole world can see. Russia has deployed the forces necessary to invade Ukraine and now has them readied for action. In the past days, we have heard Russian claims that some units are returning to barracks. It is, however, all too clear that the opposite is in fact true, and the Russian military build-up continues. Russia will say that it has the right to move its forces within its own territory, but no one has the right to threaten the use of force. Russia is patently failing to live up to the international commitments that it has made around military transparency by refusing to adequately explain its military build-up or provide the necessary transparency to build trust and to de-escalate the situation. If the Kremlin is serious about a diplomatic resolution, then it needs to show up to the diplomatic meetings and commit to meaningful OSCE talks, including via Chapter 3 of the OSCE Vienna document. They did not show up on Wednesday, and they do not intend to show up on Friday. Russia's actions are clearly designed to intimidate, to threaten, and to destabilize Ukraine. We know it, they know it, and the international community knows it. Mr. President, Russia called this meeting today to discuss Resolution 2202. That text is very clear on 2 points that reflect the core tenets of the Charter emphasized by the United Nations Secretary General when he addressed this situation only a few days ago. One, that resolving the situation in eastern regions of Ukraine can only be achieved by peaceful means. And two, that there must be full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Yet, we are seeing increasing disinformation about events in the Donbass that are straight out of the Kremlin playbook. A blatant attempt by the Russian government to fabricate a pretext for the invasion of Ukraine. It is therefore clear that we are at a critical juncture to prevent further escalation. Upholding the core tenets of the Charter in respect of peaceful resolution and respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity has never been more important. Russia must now engage with the diplomatic process we have built up over several decades and on which global security depends, and resolve this situation through peaceful means. If Russia chooses to launch an attack at this time of heightened tension, using disinformation of a pretext, it will show that Russia was never serious about diplomatic engagement. Any Russian invasion now would be a conflict of choice for President Putin and an abdication of Russia's responsibility under the UN Charter to refrain from the use of force and to maintain international peace and security. There should be no doubt that any further Russian incursion into Ukraine would be a massive strategic mistake and a humanitarian disaster that will be met with strength, including significant coordinated sanctions. And we will continue to call out the pattern of deception and disinformation from the Russian state. But if Russia is serious about the Charter and its role as a permanent member of this Council, it should give the Minsk agreements the chance to be implemented, free from coercion. It should engage seriously with diplomacy, and it should stand down all of its troops. There is still time to change path. Conflict can be avoided, and we urge Russia to match its words with actions, to withdraw its troops, to engage meaningfully in talks, and to act in the best interest of peace and security and stability in Europe. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Cleverly for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and I thank the briefers for their statements. Let me also use this opportunity to thank all personnel at the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. They contribute on a daily basis to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security on the ground. The threatening security situation in and around Ukraine is alarming. Norway is deeply concerned by Russian large-scale military buildup in occupied Crimea to the north, east, and south of Ukraine, as well as in Belarus and the Black Sea. The alleged reports of increased shelling are disturbing. They must not be used as a pretext for any military action. Norway calls on Russia to de-escalate and to engage in dialogue, constructively and in good faith, through established international mechanisms. It remains a major obstacle that Russia falsely seeks to portray the conflict in eastern Ukraine as an internal Ukrainian conflict. The reality is that Russia has fueled the conflict by providing financial and military support to the armed formations it backs. President, Norway expresses strong concern regarding the resolution of the Russian State Duma calling for the recognition of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. We warn against such a step, which would constitute a further violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and directly contradict the spirit and the letter of the Minsk agreements. Norway supports the negotiations in the Normandy format and in the trilateral contact group aimed at ending the conflict through a political settlement and implementation of the Minsk agreements. Norway calls on the parties to uphold their commitments and to engage constructively towards resolving the conflict by peaceful means. We welcome the OSCE chairmanship's renewed European Security Dialogue initiative. We encourage Russia to engage in this format. We also urge Russia to respect its commitments under the Vienna document and contribute to a constructive dialogue and exchange under Chapter 3. Norway upholds a European security order based on international law and national sovereignty and territorial integrity. These principles have repeatedly been invoked by Russia in Council discussions. Norway calls on Russia to respect these principles when it comes to Ukraine. President, through threatening posture and rhetoric and unrealistic demands, Russia is challenging European security. Every country has the right to freely choose its security alignment. We cannot allow the established security architecture to be replaced by spheres of influence. We're concerned that the ceasefire in Donbass from July 2020 has become increasingly fragile. We call on the parties to seek a durable ceasefire and do their utmost to prevent civilian casualties. The humanitarian situation is severe after 8 years of conflict. Civilians are increasingly losing access to essential life-saving services as civilian infrastructure is damaged and destroyed. Any escalation of the conflict would lead to devastating humanitarian consequences. Let me conclude by reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders in accordance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. This includes the Crimean Peninsula and its territorial waters. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. And now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, Brazil follows with concern the situation in eastern Ukraine. Persistent political stalemate and prolonged crisis have reached a critical point. In present circumstances, renewed and reinvigorated political resolve by all parties is crucial to address the conflict. Achieving and maintaining peace is our collective responsibility. We appreciate the ongoing political and diplomatic efforts aiming to restore peace and stability in Ukraine and the wider region. We firmly believe a diplomatic solution must be found to the crisis, and we will continue to support credible initiatives to bring a peaceful settlement to it. We reiterate our understanding that Resolution 2202 provides the general guidelines for a peaceful solution to the situation and a permanent stability in eastern Ukraine. Unfortunately, Resolution 2202 has not been fully implemented. Brazil urges all parties to fulfill the letter and the spirit of the Minsk agreements. We urge concerned parties to pursue genuine dialogue on the implementation of Security Resolution 2202, which provides the parameters not only to address the situation in eastern Ukraine, but also to assist diplomatic efforts to overcome the current security challenges in the region. Brazil also welcomes the resumption of talks in the Normandy format and calls for renewed commitment to find ways for a lasting peace in eastern Ukraine. A comprehensive ceasefire, which is the first point of the Minsk agreements, remains an essential element in this process. Beyond that, we need further disengagement of forces and military equipment on the ground. This disengagement must allow unimpeded access of humanitarian relief to people in most desperate need. Furthermore, trust among relevant parties is crucial to strengthening dialogue and achieving a sustainable solution. Negotiations on the parameters to grant special status to certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions must be conducted with a sense of urgency, flexibility, and the spirit of compromise. The implementation of the Minsk agreements must observe full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. All parties must bear in mind the letter of the agreements. We firmly believe that the Security Council has the utmost responsibility to avoid and condemn any attempt of a military solution to this crisis. Dialogue and negotiation are the only way forward to a lasting peace. We urge all parties to take the necessary measures to de-escalate tensions and play a constructive role in reaching a political settlement to the Ukrainian crisis in accordance with international law, particularly the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I also want to say a special thank you to Under-Secretary General De Carlo and to Ambassadors Kinnunen and Cevic today for their helpful and informative briefings. And I'd like to also recognise the presence of high-level participants at this Council this morning, Mr. President. As I begin my remarks, it's important that I'm clear. Ireland is a steadfast and consistent supporter of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognised borders. Ireland believes in and is fully committed to the core principles enshrined in the UN Charter. These include the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. Ukraine has the same fundamental right as every other sovereign and independent state to choose its own foreign policy and to ensure the security and defence of its territory. That is a right we hold to be self-evident. It's a right that Ireland struggled to obtain. As Russia's military build-up at Ukraine's border continues to raise tensions, Ireland again calls for calm, de-escalation and the pursuit of diplomacy. We need to see sustained and credible moves on the ground toward de-escalation. Genuine de-escalation will imply a significant withdrawal of both troops and equipment. We commend all who are engaged in dialogue, including through the Normandy format and Poland as OSCE Chair in Office, for launching a renewed European security dialogue. We support urgent, constructive and resolute engagement through all diplomatic channels. President, the full implementation of Minsk peace agreements and the related conflict resolution efforts in the Normandy format and trilateral contact group are important priorities for us. There is no doubt that we are now at a sensitive moment. Today, we call on all parties to act constructively within both formats. In this regard, we deeply regret the decision of the Russian State Duma to submit a call to recognise as independent entities the non-government controlled areas in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine. This would be a clear violation of the Minsk agreements. We are also concerned at reports of alleged shelling today in eastern Ukraine, as mentioned by Special